The sandcat reached the dune scar before full night settled, when the desert was supposed to be quieting itself. The sun had dropped low enough that shadows stretched long and thin, smoothing the shapes of dunes and softening contrast. Heat still lingered close to the surface, but the upper air had begun to cool. Normally, this was the pause, the brief interval when the desert stopped moving. Tonight, it did not. The dune scar ran diagonally down the slope of a large crescent dune, a pale line where sand had slid earlier in the day. It was not deep, not dramatic, just a subtle interruption in the dune's surface, where wind and gravity had briefly agreed to move material together. From a distance, it looked like a path. The sandcat approached low and silent, body compact, ears wide and forward, tail trailing lightly behind. Its paws touched the sand with minimal pressure, pads adapted to disperse weight and dampen heat. The scar felt different immediately. The sand here was denser, packed by the slide and then smoothed by light wind. It held shape longer than untouched slopes. Footprints formed shallow impressions instead of collapsing instantly. That was useful. Scars concentrated movement. Rodents crossed them, insects followed them. Scent lingered just a little longer. The sandcat followed the scar upward, angling across the dune rather than climbing directly. This reduced effort and kept the cat aligned with firmer ground. The desert was quiet. Too quiet. The cat stopped and listened. No beetle clicks. No faint wing beats. No rodent scratching beneath the surface. But the air felt wrong. The sandcat lifted its head slightly, whiskers angled forward. A faint movement brushed its face. Not wind, not yet, but rising air. The scar was still warm. The slide had exposed slightly deeper sand, which held heat longer than the surface around it. As the surrounding dune cooled, the scar released warmth upward, creating a narrow ribbon of moving air. The cat felt it before it heard it. The wind was coming back early. Normally, night winds returned later, after the surface cooled enough to create pressure differences. Tonight, the scar shortened that cycle. Warm air rising here pulled cooler air down the slope sooner than expected. The sandcat continued anyway. It used the scar as a guide, placing its paws where sand answered immediately. Each step left a clean print that did not collapse right away. Halfway along the scar, the first grains moved. Not sliding. Lifting. A thin veil of sand rose a few centimeters above the surface, then drifted sideways. The movement was gentle, almost polite, but it erased detail. The scar blurred at its edges. The cat froze. Early wind was dangerous. It moved sand before the desert had fully cooled, breaking the normal sequence. Sound distorted, scent stretched. Surface cues vanished too soon. The cat waited, lowering its body further to feel vibration through the sand rather than through air. Something moved below. A rodent tunneled shallow beneath the scar, using the compacted layer as a ceiling. The cat felt the movement clearly, until the wind brushed the surface again. The vibrations smeared. The cat waited longer. The wind returned, slightly stronger this time. The scar began to change shape subtly, its edges softening as grains were lifted and redeposited unevenly. The path was already degrading. The rodent moved again, closer now. The sandcat did not pounce immediately. Striking during early wind was risky. The moment the cat broke the surface, loose sand would move unpredictably, hiding escape routes and altering resistance. The cat shifted sideways instead, moving just off the scar onto looser sand that had already cooled. Here, wind had less effect. The surface answered honestly. The rodent reached the edge of the scar and hesitated. That hesitation was the signal. The sandcat lunged laterally, crossing the scar in a single controlled leap. The strike landed on firmer ground beyond, pinning the prey before the wind could interfere. The cat retreated immediately, carrying the rodent away from the scar. Behind it, the wind strengthened just enough to erase the last clear outline of the slide. The scar was disappearing. After feeding, the cat returned briefly to observe. The dune no longer held still. Wind traced thin lines across its surface, lifting sand from warm patches and dropping it in cooler hollows. The scar that had guided the cat minutes earlier was now only partially visible. Night had arrived, but the desert had skipped its paws. The sand cat understood. This dune would not offer stable routes tonight. Early wind meant constant adjustment. Paths would form and vanish too quickly to trust. The cat turned away from the dune and moved into lower ground between ridges, where sand cooled faster and wind arrived later. There, the normal sequence still held. Behind it, the dune continued to move quietly under the early return of air. The lesson settled. Scars were useful only when time behaved. When wind returned early, scars became traps, inviting movement just long enough to erase themselves mid-use. The sandcat disappeared into the cooler night, already revising its map of the desert, not by distance, but by timing. Because in sand, it was not the strength of the wind that mattered most. It was when it decided to come back. The sandcat did not leave the dune system entirely after the first encounter. It withdrew, but it stayed within reach. From a shallow hollow between two ridges, the cat watched the scar through the first hours of full night. Moonlight flattened the surface, erasing contrast, but the scar remained faintly visible as a smoother band where grains reflected light differently. It should have cooled by now. It had not. The cat approached cautiously, stopping short of the scar. Even without touching it, the difference was clear. Air above the scar still moved, lifting and settling grains in slow, uneven pulses. The surrounding dune lay quieter by comparison. The scar was still breathing. The cat tested the sand beside it first. Loose, cool, honest. Each pore sank and released immediately, leaving no lingering shape. Then it stepped onto the scar. The sand held. Not firmly, but longer than it should have. The cat felt resistance where there should have been none. The compacted layer beneath the surface was still intact, still warm enough to bind grains together. This was yesterday's slide, still active. The cat moved a few steps along the scar and stopped again. The wind had not returned fully, but it threatened to. Each small thermal pulse pulled air up slope briefly, then released it again. That inconsistency mattered. The cat listened for prey. Rodent activity had shifted since earlier. Movements were shorter now, more cautious. Tunneling stayed deeper, away from the surface where wind disturbed sand unpredictably. When rodents approached the scar, they paused longer than before. The cat waited. Waiting here was different. Each pause risked change. Wind could return without warning, reshaping the surface mid-stalk. The cat shortened its waiting window, relying more on positioning than patience. A rodent moved beneath the scar again, but this time it stayed lower. The vibration reached the cat faintly, then faded as air movement interfered. The cat adjusted strategy. Instead of following the scar uphill, it moved downslope, positioning itself where the scar ended and looser sand resumed. Here, the compacted layer thinned and broke apart. Heat dissipated faster. Wind lost coherence. The cat lay low and waited there. Minutes passed. The scar continued to shift subtly above, grains lifting and settling without fully moving. The dune never stopped adjusting. Then the rodent surfaced, briefly, at the edge of the scar, testing the ground before crossing. The cat struck immediately. The leap was short and direct, landing in cooler sand beyond the scar where resistance was predictable. The prey was pinned cleanly. The cat pulled back at once, retreating farther from the scar than before. It fed quickly, ears turning constantly to track changes in air. As the night progressed, the wind returned again, earlier than it should have. This time it did not fade quickly. It slid along the dune face, erasing fine detail and flattening subtle ridges. The scar vanished completely. Where it had been, the surface was now uniform. The compacted layer broke apart under renewed movement, distributing heat more evenly. The dune lost its memory of the slide. The cat watched as its former route disappeared. That was final. Scars were temporary agreements between gravity and time. Early wind broke those agreements before they could be used twice. The cat did not attempt to find the scar again. Instead, it shifted its activity entirely to Dune flats where sand cooled quickly and wind arrived late and evenly. There, waiting still worked. Vibration travelled cleanly. Surfaces answered immediately. By the deepest part of night, the Dune system was fully active. Wind moved constantly, not strongly, but persistently. No pause returned. The cat rested in a shallow depression, conserving energy, watching the dunes reshape themselves grain by grain. The lesson sharpened. A scar that held heat did not just guide movement, it shortened the night. By pulling wind back early, it erased the stillness that hunting depended on. It forced decisions faster, punished waiting, and rewarded only those who struck before the surface changed again. The sandcat would still use scars, but only once, and only at the beginning of the pause. When wind returned early, it would not follow. Because in the desert, the most dangerous paths were not the ones erased by wind. They were the ones that invited you to step onto them just before the wind remembered where to go next. The final change did not arrive with stronger wind. It arrived with regularity. The sandcat noticed it at dawn, when the desert should have been resetting itself. The wind had eased, leaving the dunes momentarily still. Fine sand settled into shallow ripples, smoothing over the night's movement. But the pause was shorter than it should have been. The cat moved along a low ridge and stopped where the dune scar had once been. It was gone to the eye, but not to the ground. The sand there still behaved differently. It held shape slightly longer. It released heat unevenly. Something had returned. Human tracks crossed the dune during the early morning hours. Not deep, not numerous, just enough to matter. Tires or boots had pressed the surface while it was cool enough to resist collapse but warm enough beneath to remember pressure. The result was subtle. Compaction did not create a visible road, it created thermal bias. When the sun rose, those pressed lines absorbed and stored heat differently than surrounding sand. By evening, they released it earlier. The wind noticed. The sandcat approached the faint track cautiously. It tested the surface with one paw. The sand resisted briefly, then yielded. That delay was familiar now. This was no longer a natural scar. It was a pattern. As night fell again, the wind returned even earlier than before. Not stronger, earlier. Thin air currents slid along the pressed lines, using them as guides. Dust lifted in long, narrow sheets that travelled predictably. The desert had learned a new route for air. The sandcat watched from a distance. Rodents avoided the pressed lines now, crossing them quickly or not at all. Insects lifted early and dispersed instead of clustering. The lines no longer concentrated prey, they scattered it. The cat tested once, only once, approaching the pressed sand to listen. Dust rose immediately, blurring vibration and flattening sound. Waiting produced nothing useful. The cat withdrew. This place had crossed a threshold. Scars created by wind and gravity were temporary. Scars reinforced by repeated weight were not. They altered timing permanently. The sandcat shifted its territory away from the main dune faces entirely, hunting instead in gravelly flats and rocky margins where wind had less control and heat dissipated faster. There, night still arrived fully before movement returned. From a distance, the dunes looked unchanged, smooth, pale, continuous. But the sandcat knew the difference now. The desert had been touched twice, once by wind, once by repetition. And repetition mattered more. The lesson was complete. Early wind was not an accident anymore. It was scheduled. For a hunter that depended on the pause between heat and air, a desert that no longer paused was not hostile. It was simply unreadable. And unreadable ground was ground that could not be trusted twice. The sandcat moved on, leaving the dunes to their new rhythm, carrying with it a revised map of the night, one that measured not distance or cover, but the exact moment when stillness failed to arrive. Because in the desert, survival depended not on knowing where to walk, but on knowing when the sand stopped listening.